July 1947, Camp 102, Yorkshire. The heatwave was relentless. The summer sun had turned the English countryside into a tinderbox. For the 80 German women prisoners living in converted wooden stables, the heat was suffocating. The wood of their barracks was dry as bone, cracking under the sun. Greta Wulf, a former literature teacher from Hamburg, sat by the window, fanning herself with a piece of cardboard. The air smelled of dry grass and tar. The camp was quiet, lethargic. The guards, usually vigilant, were seeking shade, their tunics unbuttoned. No one knew that a single spark from a faulty generator in the supply shed was about to turn their boredom into a nightmare. The smell hit Greta first. It wasn't the usual smell of coal smoke from the kitchen. It was acrid, sharp, the smell of burning rubber and old timber. She stood up, peering through the wire mesh. Across the yard, thin wisps of black smoke were curling out from under the roof of the main supply depot. Before she could shout, the depot's roof erupted. It didn't just catch fire. It exploded into a column of flame that roared upwards, fed by the fuel canisters stored inside. The alarm bell began to ring, a frantic clanging sound that shattered the afternoon peace. Chaos engulfed the camp instantly. Corporal Barnes, a young guard who was usually jumpy around the prisoners, ran into the yard, buttoning his tunic with trembling fingers. "Fire! Get the buckets! Move!" he screamed at his fellow soldiers. But it was already too late for buckets. The wind had picked up, carrying burning embers directly onto the roof of the women's barracks. The dry wood caught fire instantly, like paper. Inside, the women screamed, pounding on the locked doors. They were trapped in a wooden box that was beginning to burn. Barnes froze, staring at the burning barracks. He had the keys, but regulations were clear. Prisoners are to be kept secured during emergencies to prevent escape. If he opened the doors, 80 enemies would be loose in the chaos. If he didn't, they would burn alive. He looked at the fire hose. It was limp. The water pressure had failed. The fire was jumping from building to building. They needed to create a fire break. They needed to tear down the connecting wooden walkway before the fire reached the ammunition store. But there were only 5 guards. Not enough hands. Greta saw Barnes hesitating. She pressed her face against the hot glass of the door. "Open the door," she screamed in English, her voice cracking. "We will not run. Let us help, or we all die." Barnes looked at the terrified women, then at the spreading fire, then at the tool shed where the axes and pickaxes were stored. He made a decision that could court-martial him. He ran to the door, fumbling with the keys. The lock clicked. The door swung open, and the women spilled out, coughing, into the smoke-filled yard. But they didn't run for the forest. They looked at Barnes, waiting for orders. Barnes ran to the tool shed and smashed the lock. He grabbed a heavy fire axe. He turned to Greta. This was the moment. He was about to hand a deadly weapon to a German prisoner, a woman who might hate him, a woman whose husband might have been killed by British bombs. Their eyes met amidst the roaring flames. There was no time for politics. Barnes thrust the axe handle towards her. "The walkway," he yelled, pointing to the burning structure connecting the buildings. "Cut it down, now." Greta didn't hesitate. She grabbed the axe. It was heavy, but her adrenaline made it light. Greta swung the axe with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The blade bit deep into the dry timber of the walkway support beam. Thwack, thwack, splinters flew into the smoke-filled air. She wasn't chopping wood for a stove. She was severing the artery of the fire. Around her, the scene was one of organized chaos. Corporal Barnes wasn't pointing his rifle at them anymore. He was shoulder to shoulder with Helga, a sturdy farm girl from Bavaria, pulling down a burning fence. The hierarchy of guard and prisoner had evaporated instantly. In the face of an inferno, there were only people trying not to burn. Other women formed a bucket chain. They ran to the horse trough, the only source of water left, filling metal pails and passing them down the line. British soldiers stood in that same line, passing buckets to German women, who passed them back to British officers. The water hissed as it hit the flames, creating clouds of scalding steam. Greta's lungs burned from the smoke. Her hands were blistered from the rough axe handle. But she didn't stop. She looked to her right and saw Barnes stumble, coughing violently, overcome by the fumes. Without thinking, Greta dropped the axe. She didn't seize the opportunity to attack him or run. She grabbed Barnes by his tunic and dragged him back from the collapsing wall. "Get up," she shouted, slapping his cheek to wake him from the daze. "We need this beam down. Get up!" Barnes looked at her, his enemy, through red, watery eyes. He nodded, grabbing the other side of the beam. Together, on the count of 3, they heaved. The burning timber groaned and crashed to the ground, kicking up a shower of sparks. The connection was broken. The fire couldn't jump, but the wind shifted. Just as they thought they had contained the blaze, a gust of hot wind blew. Burning roofing felt across the yard. It landed directly on the tar paper roof of the ammunition store. Inside that small brick building were crates of grenades and rounds for the camp's rifles. If that went up, the explosion would level half the camp and kill everyone in the yard. "The ammo dump," a soldier screamed. "Run, everybody run." Panic threatened to break the line. Greta didn't run. She looked at Barnes. "Is there water?" she asked. Barnes shook his head. "Buckets are empty." There was no time to fetch more. Greta looked at the pile of heavy, wet wool blankets that the women had dragged out of their barracks to save them. An idea formed. A desperate, dangerous idea. She grabbed a sodden blanket. "The blankets," she yelled to the other women in German. "Smother it. Use the wet blankets." It was suicide to run towards an ammo dump that was catching fire, but running away guaranteed nothing. It was a race against the fuse of destiny. Greta scrambled up the wooden ladder, leaning against the ammo store, the wet wool blanket heavy over her shoulder. The heat on the roof was blistering. The tar paper was bubbling, threatening to melt through. "Throw them," she screamed. Below, the other women and soldiers tossed sodden blankets up to her and Barnes. They worked in a frantic rhythm, slamming the heavy wet wool onto the tongues of flame. The steam hissed violently, scalding their hands, but the weight of the water-soaked fabric suffocated the fire, starving it of oxygen inch by inch. For 2 minutes, the world was nothing but smoke and coughing. Then, the roaring stopped. The fire, deprived of air, sputtered and died beneath the layers of damp gray wool. The roof held. The ammunition beneath their feet remained cool enough not to detonate. Greta collapsed onto the hot tar paper, her chest heaving, her face blackened with soot. Beside her, Corporal Barnes dropped to his knees, retching from the smoke inhalation. They were alive. The camp was safe. The silence that followed was sudden and absolute, broken only by the dripping of water. Then the reality rushed back in. As the adrenaline faded, the visual truth of the situation became terrifyingly clear. Standing in the middle of the yard were 40 German prisoners. They weren't locked up, and they were armed. Helga still held a pickaxe. Greta, sliding down the ladder, still gripped the heavy fire axe. The British soldiers, now realizing the danger was over, instinctively reached for their rifles. The truce of the fire was ending. The old lines were being drawn again. A tense hush fell over the yard. One wrong move, one sudden step could trigger a massacre. Corporal Barnes stood up on the roof. He looked down at his men, who were raising their weapons. He looked at Greta, who stood firm, gripping the axe handle, her knuckles white. She wasn't raising it to strike. She was holding it like a shield. Barnes remembered her pulling him from the fire. He remembered her organizing the bucket line. He made a choice. "Stand down," Barnes barked, his voice hoarse but commanding. "Lower your weapons. Nobody shoots." The soldiers hesitated, looking at their corporal, then slowly lowered the barrels of their Leonfields. Greta looked up at him, then down at the axe. She understood the precariousness of the moment. Trust had to be reciprocal. Slowly, deliberately, she walked towards the nearest British private. She didn't hand the axe to him, blade first. She reversed it, holding the head, offering the handle. It was a gesture of surrender, but it carried the dignity of an equal. "The fire is out," she said softly. The private took the axe. One by one, the other women followed suit, piling the pickaxes and shovels by the shed. They were prisoners again. But something fundamental had changed. The morning sun rose over a blackened skeleton of a camp. The smell of wet ash was overpowering. While the ammo dump stood safe, 2 barracks were reduced to charcoal ribs against the sky. At 09, a staff car arrived, kicking up dust. Major Blackwood, the regional commander, stepped out. He was a man of pristine uniforms and ink-stained regulations, far removed from the sweat of the yard. He walked through the ruins, his boots crunching on debris. He didn't look at the exhausted women huddling in blankets. He looked at the pile of fire axes and pickaxes that were still lying near the shed, unsecured. "Corporal Barnes." Blackwood's voice cut through the silence. Barnes, face still smeared with soot, marched forward and saluted. He looked like a man who had fought a war in a single night. Blackwood didn't return the salute. He pointed a gloved finger at the axes. "Is it true, Corporal?" Blackwood asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Is it true that you unlocked the prisoners and placed weapons, deadly weapons, into the hands of 80 enemy combatants without authorization?" "The camp was burning, sir," Barnes replied. "We didn't have the manpower. If I hadn't armed them, the ammo dump would have gone up. We would all be dead." Blackwood's face didn't soften. To him, Barnes hadn't saved lives. He had broken the fundamental rule of captivity. "You gambled with the security of this realm, Corporal. You armed the Wehrmacht. That is a court-martial offense, gross negligence." He turned to the military police flanking him. "Relieve Corporal Barnes of his weapon. Place him under arrest. He is to be transferred to Leeds for trial." Greta watched from the wire fence. She saw the MP take Barnes's rifle. She saw the man who had treated them like humans being treated like a criminal. A surge of anger, hotter than the fire, rose in her chest. This wasn't right. The enemy label was destroying the truth. She pushed past the other women. "No," she shouted, approaching the group of officers. The MPs turned, hands on their holsters. "Halt!" But Greta didn't stop until she was 10 feet away. "He saved us," she cried in English, "and we saved your ammunition. There was no enemy last night, only fire." Major Blackwood looked at Greta with cold disdain. "Get back in line, prisoner," he sneered. "Your testimony is irrelevant. You are the enemy. Of course you would defend the man who set you free." He turned his back on her, dismissing the reality of the night with a wave of his hand. Barnes was shoved into the back of a truck. He looked at Greta through the canvas flap. He didn't look angry. He gave a small, sad nod. He accepted his fate, but Greta did not. As the truck engine started, she realized that the axes were gone, but she still had a voice, and she intended to use it. That night, Barrack 4 did not sleep. Greta sat at the communal table, a piece of stolen office paper smoothed out before her. She wasn't holding an axe now. She was holding a pen. "Major Blackwood says our testimony is irrelevant because we are the enemy," she told the women gathered around her. "But 80 witnesses cannot be dismissed as a lie." She began to write. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a statement of fact. She detailed the exact timeline: the fire, the failure of the water pressure, the imminent explosion, and Corporal Barnes's decision that saved the king's ammunition. One by one, they signed. Greta signed first, then Helga, then 80 others. Some signatures were elegant, some were barely legible scratches from farm hands. But each one was an act of defiance against the narrative that they were monsters. The document was smuggled out the next morning via the camp chaplain, a man who feared God more than Major Blackwood. It didn't go to the camp office. It went directly to the Judge Advocate General in Leeds, bypassing Blackwood entirely. The title of the document was simple: "The Night We Did Not Burn." The court-martial of Corporal Barnes lasted 2 hours. He stood accused of reckless endangerment and arming the enemy. Major Blackwood presented his case with arrogant certainty. But then the defense counsel produced the document. He read aloud the testimony of the 80 women. He described how they voluntarily surrendered the weapons. He pointed out that not a single round of ammunition was lost. The narrative shifted. Barnes wasn't a reckless guard who armed the enemy. He was a tactical commander who mobilized available resources to save the facility. The logic was undeniable. The charges were dropped. Barnes returned to Camp 102 one last time. He wasn't reinstated as a guard. He was transferred to a logistics unit, far from prisoners. But before he left, he walked to the wire fence of the women's sector. He didn't speak. Fraternization was still strictly forbidden. He simply found Greta in the yard. He stopped, stood at attention, and gave a sharp, crisp salute. It wasn't a salute to a superior officer. It was a salute to a peer. Greta nodded slowly. They had started as enemies, became allies in the fire, and ended as two humans who had saved each other's lives. Years later, in a rebuilt Hamburg classroom, Greta Wulf would tell her students about the war. She didn't talk about the battles or the generals. She talked about a hot July day when the world burned, and an enemy soldier trusted her with an axe. She taught them that trust is the most dangerous risk of all, but also the only one worth taking. The axe could have been a weapon of murder, but because of trust, it became a tool of salvation. If this story of fire and trust sparked something in you, if it reminded you that enemies are just people waiting for a reason to help each other, hit that subscribe button. We tell the stories of the thin line between war and humanity. Share this video to keep the memory of the fire truce alive. Thank you for watching.